Mr. Attorney General, whatever should we talk about?
Yeah, it's been quiet, you know. Well, one thing we know is Fox doesn't have anyone to put on the shows.
Well, on this momentous day, we couldn't decide whether to get the 74th Attorney General of the United States or the 85th Attorney General, so we got both of them.
77th.
77th.
Yeah.
So what's your impression, given what you've heard so far?
Well, I wish I had something original to say about this. Almost all the adjectives have been used. I mean, obviously we have to caveat it. We haven't seen it. We don't know exactly what's there. But judging from the news reports, it's the archetypal abuse of the prosecutorial function to engage in a political hit job, and it's a disgrace if it turns out to be what we think it is. Politically, it's going to be damaging, I think, to the Republican Party, simply because I think it's a no-lose situation for the Democrats. I think the impetus is really to help Trump get the nomination, focus the attention on him for 2 years, have this thing swirling around, plus whatever else comes, which I think will be damaging to whoever gets the nomination. And legally, I think it's from what I understand, it's a pathetically weak case.
Yeah, it seems to be that there's two aspects of this that are offensive, at least it seems this way to me. One is the business records part, and they've made a very strong push that they intend to litigate that to the hilt, and that he did not commit even the misdemeanor. But it seems to me that whether he did or whether he didn't, the first obligation of the prosecutor is to apply the law equally across the board to everyone.
Right.
And we're dealing with a progressive prosecutor who's made his name not prosecuting. Right. So at the very time that he's taking real felonies that are preying on New Yorkers and knocking them down to misdemeanors, if he prosecutes them at all, he's taking this case that they would never in a million years prosecute, and he's making it into a misdemeanor prosecution. And then there's the second question about whether, especially with the federal authorities who have jurisdiction over campaign finance violations, having looked at this and decided not to prosecute, he's now not only going to add this to his case, but use it to inflate the misdemeanor, not into a felony. I don't think it does it justice to say inflate it into a felony. According to Trump's counsel, and again, as you say, until we see the indictment, we don't know, it's going to be 34 felonies, 4-year counts each.
Mm-hmm. Can you hear me? I guess they had my mic off, I'm sorry. Can you hear me now? Yeah. Okay. Well, that's right. Taking the federal issue first, which is the way he appears to defeat the statute of limitations on a misdemeanor and juices up a technical misdemeanor into a felony. As you say, the federal government, the Southern District of New York, did not charge this as a campaign violation. And I saw some editorialist said something like, well, that's because Bill Barr was there. Actually, the Southern District could have done whatever they wanted. Well, I mean, they would have eventually.
I always heard that about them.
Well, but I want to point out that the administration ended 2 years ago, so Bill Barr wasn't there 2 years ago. And if the statute of limitations had not run federally, they could have done whatever they wanted to do after I left. So no one's done anything.
Right.
And so for the state DA to try to use this as a way of bootstrapping himself into a felony is sort of outrageous. But as the other thing is, the statute itself isn't as technical as it sounds. That is, it's not just falsification of a record, but the statute says with the intent to defraud. So the falsification of the record has to have the intent to defraud. It's not enough to say, well, the falsification is the fraud. There still has to be some victim of fraud, someone who is, some value is somehow taken away from. and benefited, the perpetrator. And I don't see an explanation for that anywhere. So I think it's a very weak case just on the misdemeanor. And on the federal issue, they've gotten the statute completely wrong in my mind. And I don't think the department would support this interpretation of the statute that they're taking, which is that paying, I'll call it hush money, I don't like that term, but paying hush money is a campaign contribution. I don't think the department would take that position now. I think the statute covers two different kinds of payments. Something that's a campaign contribution because it augments the campaign resources available to spend on a campaign. That's not what this is. Or the payment of a personal expense that otherwise wouldn't be paid but for the election. The only reason you pay the personal expense is because the pendency of the election. And this was, even as alleged, this was a payment of a personal expense. And I don't think they can show it's not the kind of payment that would have been made in any case. Even it wasn't done because of the election. It was done to protect Trump's reputation. And an eponymous private company certainly has an interest in protecting the brand Trump. And it's the kind of thing that probably would have been paid but for the election. So I think the whole thing is a very weak case. But it's going to hurt our politics, obviously, for the next 2 or 3 years.
Well, let me try to broaden that out too, because it just seems to me that this takes us back to exactly what you were dealing with the second time you come back to the Justice Department, which is this cycle of, once you have political intrusion, at least arguably, by the law enforcement and the intelligence apparatus of the government, then the other side wants its pound of flesh, right? We're in this cycle, and somebody has to say stop, right? At a certain point. So as you, I think, put it a number of times, how do we get the Justice Department out of politics and politics out of the Justice Department? What do we have to do for that?
So first thing, one thing I want people to understand is that there's nothing happening at the department and the bureau that isn't happening in every other institution in the country, not just federal agencies, but in every professional, medicine, science, media, everything is becoming politicized. And people are sacrificing the values and standards of the institution in order to achieve what they think is a higher political objective. That's the essence of the corruption of our institutions today. It's the politics uber alles. Frankly, if I were rating, how corrupt institutions are, DOJ, by that phenomenon, I wouldn't put the department and the FBI near the top of the list. I think as institution goes, they're actually less tainted by this. However, as Shakespeare said, lilies that fester smell far worse than weeds, which is, these are such sensitive institutions, they're so important, that, these faults are really, very glaring. But the solution, there's no fix for it that someone can come in and say, okay, let me just focus on DOJ and FBI and figure out how to make them, less politicized. There's no solution to that that is narrow and targeted. I think you have to address it more generally. But as far as what can be done that's narrow and targeted, I would say on the FBI, I think I used to be opposed to this, which is some structural change to the FBI. There's some people who want to burn it down and start it up again. I'm not sure I'd go that far. I think, however, you might want to have some kind of fundamental change, like splitting up the intel from the law enforcement side, right, which I used to oppose. But I think that could provide a catalyst for shaking up that institution, focusing the law enforcement people on law enforcement and reclaiming some of the culture. I think it would also include getting back to the standards that used to apply to people who went into the FBI. Bob Mueller and Jim Comey were all about changing the culture of the FBI. And I think what they did was they threw the baby out with the bathwater. And over the years, instead of having people coming out of the military and law enforcement who believed strongly in the law enforcement mission, understood it, were in line with it, and knew the chain of command, they've been, let's bring in kindergarten teachers and social workers and everyone and make them into FBI agents. And while we're at it, let's lower the physical requirements by 2/3 of what they used to be. And end up with like an Ivy League campus down in Quantico. And I'm not exaggerating. That's another part of the problem. And the other part of the problem is careerism among the middle management. And part of that is also the way the media treats the department, leaders and so forth. Everyone's afraid of rocking the boat. They want to just get 2 years under their belt in this job and move on to the next job, so they won't do anything to rock the boat, and therefore there's no discipline in the organization. And people are risk averse. They don't make decisions because they're afraid of the mob, the woke mob, attacking them. So it's a combination of having a president who actually understands how to run a government and that the art of running an administration in these big complex agencies is very demanding, and you have to pay attention to what you're doing, a president like that, and an AG who understands it, a cabinet secretary understands it, and the head of the FBI understands it. The other thing I would do is move much of the department and the FBI out of Washington, along with a lot of other agencies. There's really no reason any longer to have them all concentrated in Washington, D.C. So if I had my druthers, I'd put a big portion of the FBI down in Huntsville, Alabama, which is already where a lot of it, they do have some major sections down there. Well, let's just start moving them out to these places, and you just keep some of the leadership, the C-suite in Washington, D.C.
Just to underscore your perspective on this, it's not just that you were Attorney General twice. You have the additionally unique position where you were Attorney General twice, but almost 30 years apart, right? And in your memoir, which everybody should read, One Damn Thing After Another, you talk about the way things changed over that time, talking about how things on the outside seem to go faster and things on the inside, the reactive part, seem to go slower.
Right. So, when people would say to me, what's different? I say, well, things on the outside move faster, things on the inside move slower by a lot, and that's not a good combination. So in the old days, it'd take a week for a newspaper to take shape. Well, the New York Times is doing an article on such and such. It'll be out next week, something like that. There were no cell phones to speak. My cell phone was carried around by my detail, and it was like a World War II walkie-talkie. And there was no email, and there was no 24-hour news cycle or cable networks. So things moved very slowly, a leisurely pace on the outside. And then I came in, and on the other hand, I was always amazed at how quickly things would come from the desk of an AUSA up to the Attorney General's office, sometimes even within one day. It was not that bureaucratic. And the department is a pretty flat organization with only a thin veneer of political leadership. And now I went back, and all my aides are walking around with their faces buried in their phones. So-and-so just tweeted this. So this article just came out on such and such. This blog says this. It was instantaneous, all this stuff going on. Of course, the president's tweets added to the cacophony. But
well, can I ask you though, how much of that is technology driven? You're uniquely, because of your outside experience, able to address that, and how much of it is driven by sclerosis in the bureaucracy? Is the bureaucracy much different?
Yeah. So the outside has a lot of technology behind it. It also has the mob mentality behind it. The media has given itself largely over to acting as a mob and a partisan mob at that. So there's really no prudence or thought given to it. It's just this instantaneous, visceral attacks. But inside, there's a lot of sclerosis. But it's not just sclerosis. It's timidity, which is understandable because it goes back to what I said about the FBI. People are afraid to make decisions. And I would find out, where has this been? I mean, this thing came in a year ago. Well, so-and-so, this division is still having conversations with this. If there's a disagreement, bring it up. I mean, that's what our job is up here, to deal with that, okay? Not just hide it in the bowels, playing ping pong with it down in the bureaucracy, but people are risk averse.
How much of it is the org chart, and how much of it is a personnel thing?
It's not, to me, it's not so much the org chart. It's just that we live in an environment where everyone is risk averse and doesn't want to do it. So take the Gardner case, the guy who was jumped on by some cops in
the Staten Island,
right, and he suffocated. That was pending 5 years, and the statute was about to run out. The statute of limitations on it was about to, and we were going to sort of decide the case by not making a decision. And I said, that's ridiculous. There's been a disagreement within the department. The Civil Rights Division had one position. The Eastern District of New York took another position, which they did even under the Obama administration, that there was no civil rights crime there. And I said, I'm going to make the decision. Made the decision.
Good thing it wasn't falsification of records, because they would have gotten right on that.
Right. But there is more. When I was back under Bush, and they were trying to get an independent counsel appointed under Iraqgate, which was sort of a early version of Russiagate. It was just a complete vaporous lie that they had cynically used against Bush in the last year of his administration. And I said publicly at one point, people say, oh, you're a toady for Bush, you're protecting Bush and you're sitting on all this, and you won't appoint a special counsel. I said, well, there's no crime. And then I said, if there's any lawyer in the department who disagrees with me on this, and especially in the fraud, the public integrity section, but anyone, they're free to come forward and say so, that I'm not making the right decision. Crickets. Now, if I did that under Trump, there'd be letters from 6,000 AUSAs,
Well, I want to ask you about something specific about that. Probably the most notable incident toward the end of your tenure, right? After the election, with all the noise going on, you come out and say that the department is going to look into allegations of fraud.
Right.
And there's, crying, gnashing of teeth, et cetera. And yet, if you hadn't stepped up and made that call, you would not have been in a position, was it a couple of weeks later, to come out and say,
3 weeks.
There's nothing there, right?
Yeah.
So what about the importance of being able to tune out the noise and make a decision?
I think it's very important, which is the reason I actually ended up deciding maybe I should interview with Trump, talk to Trump. He wanted to talk to me. And it's because in today's environment, you have to have no plans beyond being Attorney General. You have to be willing to make whatever decisions you think are right and just let the chips fall where they may. Otherwise, you're not going to do your job. And so it's critically important. And that's a perfect example of it, Some jerk down in the public integrity section, had taken it upon himself to put in this rule. It wasn't a rule, it was just his sort of protocol, which is that you shouldn't investigate allegations of election fraud until after the election is not only held, but certified. So it's all over. And the reasoning for that is the investigation could interfere with the election itself. This is mind-bending to me. But
this is the Assistant Attorney General for sclerosis, right?
Yes, right. So I said, well, whatever may be said of that rule and generally, we're in a situation where we've had voting for 2 months in some places. You've had changes of procedures. You have states doing things they've never done before, like hiring a lot of temporary people. They don't have processes for doing a lot of this. And there's a high risk here. And there's sometimes that maybe we can find something that we could actually cure. We'll be sensitive to not interfering. But there may be circumstances where we should do it. And certainly after the election is held, the idea that you shouldn't look into it just doesn't make any sense to me. So I changed it, and I put out guidance that we would look at. And of course, Barr is doing this because he's Trump's toady, and he is going to find fraud on behalf of Trump. I was very skeptical that the election was stolen from the very first night. And I frankly feel that and I discussed this with a number of people, when you have half of the country or more believing the election has been stolen, and you have this aggressive story going out, sometimes said with great, panache about, Italian satellites and, thermostats and everything else. If you have no one in a position to say, we've looked into that, that's nonsense, what are you going to do? And so I felt I had to put myself in a position to react to this. And I don't know what would have happened if the department was not in a position to say, we don't think the election was stolen. This is an incumbent administration. And, what do you do if a lot of people in the country think that it's been stolen and that it should remain in power? Could have been a constitutional crisis.
Yeah. Well, to my mind, it was the most important and courageous act in a time that was a terrible time for the country.
Yeah.
So
well, thank you.
Owe you gratitude for that.
Thank you.
What does the department look like when things are working the way they're supposed to work? And what I mean by that is, what's the department's role in law enforcement writ large in the country? It seems like, we have Republican administrations, and the priority seems to be understanding that the force multiplier in law enforcement is state municipal police, right? Comparatively, there's many fewer federal agents. So you try to throw the power that you have, the federal power, to try to boost what they can do and deal with the crime problems. And then Democratic administrations come in, and they seem to think that their mission is to reform the police and the concept of policing itself. So they use the Civil Rights Division and these pattern and practice investigations to get these consent decrees where the police have to sort of adhere to the guidelines that the federal government wants to promote. What do we suppose? Should it be that when the Justice Department changes hands from administration to administration or party to party that we have this kind of careening? And what's the effect of the police or on the police?
Well, in some ways, it shouldn't be dramatic. To me, some swinging back and forth is inevitable. It shouldn't be as dramatic as it has been, and it wasn't. When Clinton came in, he actually kept up most of the law enforcement policies that we had under Bush 1. Right. So there wasn't that much of a jerking around. But as the Democratic Party has moved further and further to the left, and their ideas about law enforcement have become more bizarre, then you're going to have sharp swings. Now, I could be accused of not following my own principles in a sense, because I believe in federalism. I think one of the problems of the big central problem of our republic is that we're trying to govern our country as a consolidated 350 million person unitary government instead of relying on federalism, and that the federal government's role should be sharply curtailed and focused. But by the same token, there's something to be said for the federal government playing a leadership role depending on what the crisis of the day is. So the first time I was in the Attorney General, we had the highest crime rates in American history. They had quadrupled in the 60s and 70s. And under Reagan, it started going down, but it still went up 12% during the 80s. So that between 1960 and 1990, when I entered the job, it had quintupled, and it is the highest level ever. And it was by far the most important issue in the country, except when we were fighting the Gulf War, after the Gulf War. And I felt that the federal government, by focusing on three areas that had usually had a federal role, which were gangs, organized criminality, drugs, and guns, which have traditionally been regulated by the federal government, that by using our tough laws in that area, we could actually help the states make a dent in going after the chronic violent offenders, which we did. And through a very aggressive program of setting up joint task forces to do that, 1992 was the first year in 3 decades that there was a...
Just to interrupt you, when you say joint task force, you're talking about federal
and state
okay.
and local. And we also said, we need prisons to put these people in. While crime had gone up, incarceration rates had gone down. So 1992 was the first year the crime rates went down, and they went down for 22 consecutive years and were cut in half. And that reduced, for example, black murders by 5,000 a year. I mean, those are black lives that people should pay attention to. So cutting down on that crime, we were successful until Obama in 2014, and crime started going back up again. So my view was, okay, fine, and then of course all of a sudden the liberals discover federalism and saying we're federalizing street crime. Well, not really, but part of it was educational, which was to demonstrate, look, you have a tough system, you're going to reduce crime. It's not rocket science as how you can reduce predatory violence. You just take the predators and put them in prison for a while. And once you show that that works, it's easier to get the laws reformed, which they were. And so that's why prison population doubled over that 22-year period. Went from 800,000 to 1.6 million in the country. And then the liberals would say, we're putting people in prison and yet we have low crime rates. How about the word, how about the issue of causality there, But anyway.
Well, we have a little over 2 minutes left, and there's about 25 other things I want to ask you about. So let me ask you about Mexico, because I know you've given a lot of thought to that. Well, how much can law enforcement bring to the table to deal with what we're dealing with, not just at the border, but the threat behind the border, and what else could government be doing about it?
Well, in a nutshell, there's no silver bullet in the sense that we can reduce demand by itself and solve the problem. That's a long-term issue, and good luck at that as long as there's cheap, ubiquitous supply.
You're talking about fentanyl?
Fentanyl, but then all drugs, methamphetamine. We didn't have a meth problem in half the country, and now we do because there's a lot of cheap meth available from Mexico. You also need to attack supply. And my view always has been the way to attack supply is at the head of the snake, the source. You can lock up generation after generation of street gang that distributes it in Philly and Detroit or wherever, but you have to go for supply at its source. We can destroy cartels, root and branch, which we did in Colombia during a 5-year period where the government of Colombia and we worked together. But in 1995, the Clinton administration pulled back from that kind of forward activity and allowed the Mexican problem to grow. And now we're dealing with these paramilitary organizations, tens of thousands, that can fight the Mexican military to a standstill. We have essentially in my opinion, Mexico has become a failed narco state. I think the government is largely corrupt and cowed because the cartels have unlimited resources to bribe, and they have the ability to assassinate, kill policemen's families, stuff like that. So the current leader, who's a left-wing socialist, his idea obviously, was to try to coexist. And as long as the cartels were acting against the gringos up north and they cut down on murders in Mexico, he was happy to coexist. We can't accept that as the status quo, nor can we work effectively through the Mexicans, because the Mexicans aren't interested in tackling the cartels. So it's also grown to a point where it cannot be won on a case-by-case basis. These are paramilitary organizations. They even have armored units, for Christ's sake.
So an AUMF that would let us at
Yeah,
least
I would, number one, I would make it clear to the Mexicans that we're going to take care of this, and we want them to be with us. They ultimately will, once they understand that will do it. They will join us, if for no other reason than, as Trump showed, we can destroy their economy, and once we demand something, they will do it.
Right.
They
That's good news then.
Yeah.
Good, because
Yeah.
I promised we would stop on good
Okay,
news.
all right.
Ladies and gentlemen, Attorney General Bill Barr.
Thank you.